often turn to philosophy when we feel like getting super heady and abstract. But when it comes to issues of practical ethics, philosophy is supposedly a valuable tool in helping us decide what the right thing to do is, and how to do it.
I'm sorry. Choices are hard for me when I'm under pressure.
I know that, buddy, but we're short of time here, and it's kind of important for Eleanor.
Right, which is why I can't take this lightly. What if I screw up?
Case in point, when you encounter an unhoused neighbor asking for money or food, what's the proper ethical response? And more generally, what is our moral responsibility towards struggling members of our communities? As America's housing crisis continues to worsen, everyone seems to have an opinion on how homelessness should be solved on a structural level. But we'd argue that what makes it such a touchy and divisive issue is how it makes us feel on a personal level. Each time we see an unhoused person in the street, we're faced with the same uncomfortable question: do we help? And if so, how much? How can it be morally okay that we have a roof over our heads and they don't? And what duty do we have to make things right? So, does philosophy have any of the answers here? Let's find out in this Wisecrack Edition, Does Giving Make You Good? The question of whether or not to give money to someone you pass on the street is a surprisingly hot-button issue. In terms of our own moral principles, it can feel like a test where we actually have to put our money where someone else's mouth is. Many of our philosophical ideals, from the existence of God to how we define truth, can go largely unchallenged in our day-to-day lives. But our response to those in need requires an active ethical choice every time. And deep down, it can feel like that choice says a lot about us. So then, what does it say? Well, it's possible that it says less about whether or not you're a good person, and more about whether you feel the need to perform the act of charity to prove that you are one.
You gotta give! Hey! If you do something and you don't give, you don't...
Some would argue it's simply a publicity stunt for our own egos rather than a selfless good deed, i.e. virtue signaling. For a lot of us, this element of performing goodness leads us to lean on a popular but wishy-washy half measure. When I have time, I buy a person a sandwich. This makes us sound like we care, but at the end of the day, when I have time is a big caveat. I mean, who ever actually hauls over to Subway to make good on that? It feels like a politically correct response that rarely requires an actual follow-through. On the other hand, the choice not to help can be its own form of virtue signaling. A demonstration of the belief that we don't have the social responsibility to pay for someone else's needs, or even that it's good to resist socially manufactured guilt. This gets people all fired up, because it requires us to reveal how we judge and treat people we don't know. It also forces us to acknowledge that our actions aren't always in line with our moral principles. Homelessness, to state the obvious, is an incredibly hard thing to experience. And our knowledge of that reality also makes it hard to witness. We don't like to see people hurting and in pain. And we certainly don't like to feel like we're behaving with indifference towards their suffering. Philosopher Colin Radford points out that just facing the question of do I give can produce tremendous anxiety. The moral quandary of whether to behave in line with our ideals or risk feeling like an asshole can paralyze us with indecision to the point where we do nothing. When lost in the sauce of complex moral decisions, passivity becomes the easiest path. And thus, giving to the unhoused becomes a deeply polarizing issue because it's inherently personal, and everyone seems to have an opinion on who's to blame. Some blame the unhoused folks themselves. Others blame a lack of affordable housing and the housing associations that keep it that way. Add landlords, the government, society at large. There are a lot of people to point our fingers at. But what about us? Are we as citizens responsible for homelessness? Do we have a moral obligation to give when we can? And as uncomfortable as it may be, what decision should we make? Before we continue, let's clear up some common misconceptions. First of all, using the term homeless to describe people rather than their condition isn't great. That's because it's unfairly associated with moral depravity, personal failure, and/or a permanently nomadic lifestyle. Many who experience homelessness are financially insecure families that have been forced to rely on makeshift housing solutions like living out of their car. By calling people homeless, like we'd call someone a lawyer, an Italian, or a fiery redhead, we're ascribing them with a fixed trait, rather than treating homelessness as the temporary and contingent condition that it is. It's really easy to dehumanize and marginalize people when we reduce their whole identity to where they live.
A home is an abstract idea. A home is a setting. It's a state of mind. These people need houses, physical, tangible structures.
We also tend to point the finger at mental illness to explain why so many people end up on the street. but less than a third of the unhoused population has a severe mental illness. What's more, studies have shown that mental illness is not the cause of homelessness. Rather, homelessness exacerbates mental illness. And while stereotypes tell us that homeless folks make poor financial decisions, studies have shown the exact opposite to be true.
You've had a lot of hassle since you bought it. In retrospect, was it worth buying it?
I mean, it remains to be seen as to whether this was financially smart. Currently, it is not.
Psychologist Jia Yang Zhao found that after giving a group of unhoused people a significant amount of money, they did not increase their spending on drugs or alcohol. Rather, the additional funds helped recipients reduce their time spent homeless by almost 100 days.
We found that the cash transfer reduced homelessness by 99 days per person per year.
I mean, we don't mean to blow your minds here, but a super effective antidote to poverty is money. According to homeless advocacy group Invisible People, these negative misconceptions about homelessness are often the result of a lifetime of shitty media representations of the unhoused that paint them as the architects of their own misery. And the solutions on offer to this situation are that they either get their acts together or we toss them a little charity every now and then out of the goodness of our hearts. Naturally, this impacts the way we respond to the problem in our own lives, and tends to result in our reducing folks in need to a scary, unrelatable other. But a 2019 survey revealed that 59% of Americans are one missed paycheck away from experiencing homelessness themselves. Given these realities, what can philosophy tell us about how to ethically respond to homelessness? Well, as always, philosophers have a few different ideas. For example, the utilitarian position would posit that the right thing to do is the one that produces the most happiness for the most people. Philosopher Peter Singer explained this worldview with his cheery, drowning child thought experiment. It goes, if I walk past a shallow pond and see a kid drowning, I should pull that kid out even if it muddies my limited edition Chucks. Sure, it sucks that my sneakers are full of pond scum, but I think we can agree that it's objectively better than letting a kid die. Unless you hate children. In which case, who hurt you? This logic feels obvious, but Singer believes that if we want to make the world a better place, we should extend that logic into every aspect of society. Giving a few bucks to an unhoused person isn't much of a sacrifice, but it can potentially mean the difference between someone going to bed hungry or with a warm meal in their belly. Thus, in the utilitarian view, an excuse like, sorry, I'm late for work, becomes a lot like letting a kid drown so our clothes stay dry. But it's still not clear how much we should give. Should we sell our furniture, empty our savings, and put our collector's edition of the Princess Diana Beanie Baby up on eBay? Singer doesn't believe that we need to go this far, but he does say that we Americans probably have a higher standard of living than is morally defensible, especially considering that many of the luxuries we enjoy in the States, like iPhones and disposable H&M crop tops, are bad for the planet and are made possible through the exploited labor of folks, including children, in the developing world. That said, even if we decide giving is the right thing to do, it's also worth asking, how do we give? Some might avoid giving directly to individuals in need by donating to official venues, like food banks and homeless shelters. Singer's theory on giving has led to the contemporary effective altruism movement, which we've talked about before. The stated goal of effective altruism is to strategically use charitable money to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. To that end, they employ tons of statistical analysis to take away the guesswork, i.e., they'll tell you what nonprofits or charities will be most effective stewards of your spare change. Now, the problem, of course, is that not everyone agrees on what the greatest good is, and many critique the EA perspective for not being critical of the economic and political systems producing the problems they're trying to solve via charity. For example, if economic inequality produced by political decisions is leading to widespread poverty, maybe we should be asking some political questions too, instead of just, throwing money at the problem. While the utilitarian side of the debate prioritizes doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, Deontology, often associated with Immanuel Kant, argues that the consequences of our actions matter less than the ethical motivations behind those actions. In other words, intent matters more than outcome. Also, in other words, your fortune cookie lied to you. Kant articulated this position via his categorical imperative, the idea that you should act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. This basically means that you're only ethically bound to do something if you think that everyone else should act the exact same way in the same situation. So no lying to others unless you think it's fine for everyone to lie to you, and no casually stealing food from the hot bar at Whole Foods unless you think everyone should also be stealing food from the hot bar at Whole Foods, which they totally should, and in which case you are absolutely right. Also, let us know in the comments if you do this and what you steal. We won't snitch. I'm always stealing some curry.
Sometimes it takes 16 margaritas for 4 coworkers to have a good time.
But you know what? If this is so important to you,
take it. Are you happy now, you miserable narc?
This idea applies to constructive examples. If you think everyone should support their struggling neighbors, then you should do the same. In fact, Kant's argumentation suggests that we have a moral obligation to, simply because that's the right thing to do. That said, one could ask if a deontological ethical perspective puts too much pressure on individuals to make the world a more ethical place, rather than putting the onus on systems of power to take responsibility for those in need. Even though deontological ethics is in some ways oppositional to utilitarian ethics, it could be argued that both positions share an overemphasis on the moral responsibility of individuals. And in turn, they also share a lack of emphasis on how structures and systems create the conditions which require our charity and ethical action in the first place. Even when armed with these different philosophical perspectives, I don't know what to do, and I still feel terrible about it. Kant argues that these feelings of guilt, discomfort, resentment, and helplessness are normal considering the situation. We feel bad because we should. It's f***ed up that our society has so many people with nowhere safe to call home. But whether we're utilitarians, deontologists, or neither, we can always come up with a clever justification for why we didn't help someone in need. Bradford points out that all of this deliberation about morality and ethics is pointless, considering we seldom act according to our principles anyway. He explains that our moral principles, while not completely irrelevant to how we make big decisions, often play a minor or even detrimental role in our lives. In other words, rather than running through a mental playback of principles when it comes to our choices, we're more likely to just follow our guts. And if we later find our actions and principles don't jive, we can generally find a way to justify it and get on with our day. Now, this isn't great, of course, but at this point, we think it's worth taking a step back to consider, are we even asking the right question in the first place? As we noted earlier, the individual dilemma, should you give, that's been manufactured and repeated ad nauseum by the media, reframes the problem of homelessness as an issue to be tackled by individuals rather than by, say, a functioning social safety net.
But you gotta give.
I'm sorry?
You gotta give.
The concept of the carbon footprint, as we talked about in our recent climate change video, was similarly used as a way to make the rise in greenhouse gases a you problem instead of a these industries need to seriously clean up their act problem. Corporations and government institutions regularly use the pressure of individual responsibility as a smokescreen to avoid having to take any real accountability.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
In other words, they point the finger at us, so we don't point it at them. Unless you're a secret heiress, in which case, please join our Patreon. We have tons of fun perks. There's not a ton we can individually do about the housing crisis.
Me? A princess? Shut up!
But German thinker Max Scheler suggests that we can help a little by reframing our thinking in terms of double incorporation. That means striving to see the I in the we and the we within the I, and presumably the TEAM in team. In other words, we're all part of a community, and our community is part of us. The problem, of course, is that social stigmas often erase our unhoused neighbors from our conception of community. To that end, scholar Anya Daly advocates for widening our circles of compassion. When we expand our circles to include others, we overcome what Einstein called the optical delusion, the idea that we're separate from everything and everybody else. It's impossible to say whether giving makes us good, but as Daly argues, it's another point of connection that makes us more human. And listen, we don't know how to solve this, philosophically or practically, but we do know that any ethically comprehensive solution to these problems would have to involve consulting the people who have actually experienced homelessness themselves. In Los Angeles, formerly unhoused folks who have become advocates, case managers, and advisors fighting the homelessness crisis have reported being sidelined when it comes to executive-level decision-making. One said, "We get brought in because people want to just hear our stories, but when it comes to implementation, decisions are made by those who don't know what it's like to be homeless." So if we want a world where we don't have to keep asking ourselves these questions, we could probably start by fixing that. Because if we just let wealthy politicians and their real estate developer buddies propose innovative market-based solutions, well, we're gonna have to buy a lot of sandwiches. But what do you guys think? Is there a clear philosophical answer to the question of charitable giving? Does focusing on how we as individuals behave when faced with homelessness obscure the real causes of the crisis? And how do we shift the narrative from our delicate feels to a more compassionate and inclusive mindset? Let us know what you think in the comments. Huge thanks to our patrons as always, and if you're interested in getting all of our videos early with no ads, along with extra audio and video content, check out the link in the description. And thanks to everyone for watching, commenting, liking, subscribing, and everything else, as it really helps us keep the channel going. Later. By reframing our thinking in terms of double incorporation. Sorry, hold on. And on that line, I always read it as double penetration. Continue. Okay, let's keep going. I know. How could you not?